Hi, students. We are going to discuss some sensitive topics in social problems class this week. We're going to talk about the generic definitions of what race and ethnicity are, but this is going to be the only video that you see me in this week because I have a long documentary. It's not quite an hour and a half long, but it's a much longer video than you're used to watching in class. And so I'm only going to have this one video to give you some information about what race and ethnicity are from a sociological perspective, and some other concepts that you'll read in the section of chapter 9 that we're focused on this week. Words like assimilation, words like cultural imperialism, words like genocide, these topics are going to be a big part of the video that you're going to watch after, it's a documentary from Deutsche Welle news channel, DW news channel out of Europe. But before we do that, you need some basic background that your textbook reading assignment provides, but also it needs, I think, sometimes a little bit more clarification because it's just maybe not common language when we see definitions of these things sometimes. And so what I mean by that is you'll often see in a textbook like ours, when we define race from a sociological standpoint, you'll see the phrase it's a social construction, or it's a cultural paradigm, or a cultural construction. And these words are not, common everyday talking. We don't hear that in our common everyday speech. And so I want to explain what that means. So race is a term that does not have real meaning in biology. Like, for instance, you can take a lion and you can take a tiger, and biologically you can measure down to the genes that people are lions and tigers are very different from each other, but people, genetically, we are not so different from each other that we are different species of humans. There's one species of human, but there's lots of variety to the physical characteristics that we have on the outside. All of us are humans, but there's a lot of variety to the way that we look and the way that we perceive each other from what shows on the outside. So we are all one race, the human race, but socially, from one society to the next, the outward physical characteristics that people can see become ways that we put people into boxes and categories. And so a race, as a social construction, a cultural construction, means that from one society to the next in the world, each individual culture defines people as certain races based on a collection of their external physical characteristics that are observable to the naked eye. Okay, so the same physical characteristics that exist in this culture to define races don't define those races in other cultures, or those races don't exist necessarily in other cultures the way that we would define them in the United States. And so, for instance, I have some suggestions or a list of certain physical characteristics that happen to be used commonly for racial categories around the world. Certainly skin color is an outward physical characteristic that is observable. And so it's often used eye shape, nose shape, hair texture, your build or your height. Are you tall and skinny? Are you short and kind of stocky? These are outward physical characteristics that you can observe that different cultures, different places in the world use to categorize people and separate people into different groups, to compartmentalize people. And so I used to use, or sometimes in my sociology classes, I use the movie, which is a real depiction of historic events, the movie Hotel Rwanda. Rwanda is a country in Africa, and it has essentially two racial groups of people in that country. There are two tribes or racial groups. One of them is called the Hutus, and the other one is called the Tutsis or the Watutsis. You can look this up in recent history toward the end of the 20th century. Hotel Rwanda is the movie, but it was about actual events. It was a race war. It was a genocide race war, and the Hutus and the Watutsis to a USA mindset, because in the USA we typically use skin color and hair texture to classify what we call African Americans or black. In Rwanda, everyone would fit that same characteristic, and so to a USA point of view, we have a hard time understanding that it was a race war that they were fighting, because to us everybody looked like they were members of the same race. But I should have looked this up to make sure I get this right. In Rwanda, the Hutus and the Watutsis, one group, I can't remember which one it was, one group tended to be taller and leaner, and the other group tended to be shorter and stockier. I believe nose shape. I think the shorter, stockier group also had like a shorter, flatter, like wider nose. And the other group, the taller, leaner group, had like a longer, more angular nose in general. And so I'm talking about external physical characteristics. They just don't happen to be the same external physical characteristics that we use in our culture to define race. There's a lot of external physical characteristics that for some reason we don't use. Like, for instance, my earlobes are not attached to the side of my cheek there, but a lot of people's are. Maybe yours are. Are your earlobes attached to your cheek? Mine aren't. That's an external observable physical characteristic that could be used, because race is really meaningless except from a cultural standpoint. It's meaningless as far as biology goes. But there's an easy thing that we could just as easily use to classify race. We don't happen to use that, but it's observable. It's there. We could easily use it. What about toe length? I'm not going to show you my dirty little feet, but I have little short toes. My big toe is the longest, and then I have my toes get shorter and shorter after that. But my husband has great big long big toe, but his two toes after that are even longer than his big toe. Right? It's a physical observation that we can make a difference between his feet shape and my feet shape, or foot shape, whatever word I should use there. So there's an observable physical characteristic that's different that could, if we happened to live in a society that used toe length as the observable physical trait, that could mean that my husband and I are in two different racial categories. That's how, and if that sounds silly, if that sounds ridiculous, the earlobe thing, if that sounds silly or ridiculous, all the other stuff is just as silly and just as ridiculous. It just happens to be culturally defined for us. And so we see it as real. We think of it as real. But these real concepts in our mind differs in other cultures, and it makes race a very tricky topic to discuss in a social problems class, because there is definitely not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to race relations and race issues within a society. Race issues that exist in one place, in one time, are not at all going to be a cookie-cutter copy of racial issues that exist in another place at another time, or even the same time. Not at all, because every culture is different and every culture defines race. In some cases, there are similarities to the way a collection of cultures define race, but you always base it on external physical characteristics, and that's how racial groups in a society play out. Okay? And it gets deep meaning culturally, so it's something that becomes very strong, has a very strong cultural meaning to people. But scientifically, biologically, race is not something that we can measure, that different racial groups are so different from each other that they're a different species and therefore biologically distinct. No, we can't say that. Okay, another topic that honestly the video is going to focus more on ethnicity than it does race. But ethnicity, let me see, can you see that? Ethnicity is a concept that a lot of times, especially my intro to sociology students, are confused about this, but you're not. You've already had that class, so you probably understand this distinction already. Ethnicity is a term that refers to the culture a group has. The culture that a group and the group members share in common that is distinctive with other groups and other cultures. So, for instance, some things that make us distinctive from each other would be the language that we speak. Maybe we speak the same language, but we have a different accent when we speak it. So, if you hear somebody from Australia speaking English, you can tell, oh, they're not one of me, right? They are a they and not one of us, right? Just based on the accent that they speak. But quite often, there's tons of different languages in the world, and so language is a cultural marker that can identify a specific ethnicity of people. Religion is a biggie. Are you a Christian? Are you a Jew? Are you a Muslim? Muslim is the religious category that we will be focusing on in the documentary that you're going to watch after you're finished with me. Customs, rituals, history, habits, attitudes, the foods that you eat, the way that you prepare foods, all of these different kinds of things are markers of your ethnicity. And ethnicity is more real than race is, because ethnicity is about your behavior. I don't have that word written on the board behind me. You should include it in your notes. Your ethnicity refers to your group's cultural characteristics. Cultural characteristics include the norms and the behaviors that you follow, the rituals, the customs, the religious belief system, and the religious patterns that you live out in your daily life. The language that you speak, all of these kinds of things. And so this makes us more distinctive from each other than other groups. For instance, I used a minute ago in this video, I used the term African American and I used the word black. Black is the appropriate word to use when you're talking about a racial category and how we define it in the United States. African American is an ethnicity. And just to illustrate that fact, I had a student, this was years ago, I had a student who was from London, England, or a suburb of London, England, and I can't do accents, but when she spoke, you could clearly tell she had an English accent. And so when she was in class and we were talking about this topic in, the basic sociology class, she raised her hand to comment that she agreed that African American was an ethnicity and black was a race. Because I wish I could do her accent. I'm terrible at accents, so I'm not even going to try. But she said that when she meets people here in Central Arkansas, pardon me, that they would hear her accent and they would say, where are you from? And she would tell them, well, I'm from England, and not England, Arkansas, but England across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe. And that's where I'm from. And that people were fascinated because of her accent, that language marker that was very different from our own here in the southern United States. And she said inevitably, whenever she met someone from our culture, after they spoke to her for a while, they would ask her, they would say that they were surprised that there were African Americans in England. And she would say, well, there are not any African Americans in England. African American is something that exists only in the USA. There are a lot of black people in England where she's from, but there isn't a distinction culturally where behavioral patterns, accents, religious beliefs, customs, rituals, foodways, this kind of thing was distinctive from anybody else who was British. So the racial category existed, but the ethnic category did not. And so that's an example about how these things are specific to a culture. Now, you will read in our textbook about hatred, discrimination, targeting, oppression, genocide against these different categories of people. Genocide means killing a group of people, and often ethnic groups are targeted by powerful groups in society to eliminate them from the population. And the video that you're going to watch right now implies that the country of China in present day, doesn't just imply, it shows evidence that the country of China in present day that is ruled by an ethnic majority, the majority rule in China is an ethnicity called Han Chinese, and there are lots of territories that are considered part of the Chinese country, like Tibet, for instance. China considers Tibet to be part of its geopolitical borders. Tibet does not. They have nothing in common with the Han, and there's friction there, and people around the world that call for Tibet to be free. Well, there is another area in China that has an ethnic population and indigenous population. Please look that word up if you don't know what indigenous means. But it's an indigenous population called the Uyghurs. Let me show you how to spell that. Let me see, where can I grab a marker? Right over here. Okay, and so there's a couple of different ways to spell it. You can spell it like this, Uyghur, just like this, Uighur, or you can spell it like this, Uyghur. And so either way, when you search for it, you can, either of those terms are correct, but you pronounce it Uyghur. And this is an ethnic group that happens to be Muslim. They speak their own distinct language. They don't speak the same language as the Han Chinese. And you will see, let me just give you a fair warning. There's also kind of a disclaimer on the video. You will see evidence of torture, evidence of mistreatment, evidence of genocide in this video that was made by this news organization in Germany about the treatment of the one ethnic category of China, the Han Chinese, who are the most powerful and in control of the Communist Party there, over an ethnic minority in a particular area, the Uyghurs. And so you will see how these kinds of issues that you're reading about in the first few pages of this chapter, it makes it real for you. It's not enough to read the word genocide, know how to spell the word genocide, be able to identify a definition of what the word genocide means. This is a lot of what we do in academia. Here's a word, here's the definition, memorize it. But it's often much more profound, and it affects our learning process and our memory of it in the years to come if we can actually see evidence, hear testimony, and understand a term and what the consequences of that action actually are in real life. And so that's my motivation for showing you this video this week. Just having this one video with me and then a documentary to focus on with a very short reading assignment so that you can have like some real life ideas about what this means. Quite often in this nation, we have our share of problems, right? We have our share of friction among different groups, racial groups, ethnic groups. We definitely have our share of friction, but it's very important to understand how much more profound the friction or the torture or the death wish can be in other areas of the world that don't have the same protections that the legal system in the United States provides us as its citizens. So I don't know that you're going to enjoy the documentary because it's pretty hard to watch. Definitely don't watch it when your kids are around. Don't think that you can watch it if your kids are in the same room with you. You shouldn't do that. So please set some time aside where you can do it privately or with your spouse or significant other, somebody who's an adult who's going to be able to handle these issues. So it's on YouTube. It's something that YouTube agreed to publish, so it's not going to be too gruesome for you to handle. But please, that's my disclaimer. And I know that you will text me if you have any questions, and I look forward to your reaction papers this week because I think you're going to have some profound statements to make and some realizations to make about reality having to do with these issues worldwide and not just focus on the United States as our textbook kind of focuses on the United States, but these issues are even more deeply felt in other places, if you ask me. Okay, so I will see you next week for more information. Text me with questions. Bye.